All right, today's madness, I should explain this up front. I have gone through from 79-80 until this past season and listed the 5 worst teams in the league, with the worst team in the league at the top. So this means they're the cream of the crop rebuilding team. And down to number 5, which in the 80s means you're 17 out of 21. So you're not necessarily as bad as, say, these 26, 27, 25 ranked teams. So, again, when you look at it, the question then becomes one of, do you win a Stanley Cup after tanking for a while? Because you always see that, like, this team should just sell off and tank. Right. Here's Colorado after tanks. Their tanks were in the form of just being really bad. And Colorado's on the board in 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, and 85. So that is 6 in a row, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I missed. Look at that. Yeah, I got to change that. New Jersey / Colorado is on the board 8 out of 10 years. And you wonder why Gretzky called them a Mickey Mouse organization? That'll do it. The Hartford Whalers, represented by the Carolina Hurricanes there, are on the board 4 times in a row in the 80s. And again, the Whalers didn't win a Stanley Cup, and the Devils didn't win Stanley Cups with players they picked up until 85. So all of that losing only meant they were poorly run. And that's the thing I look at when it comes to the desire to do a rebuild and let's just tear it all apart. Yes, it worked in 2016 for Toronto. I get it. They worked. They tore it all apart. They won the lottery. They got Auston Matthews. Hey, look, that's how it works. It's not, though. And that goes throughout here. And the question then becomes one of, well, do you have to have a rebuild to win? No. Anaheim's only been in the bottom 5 of the NHL twice in the 90s, once in the 2000s, and once in the 2010s. They've never bottomed out. So their record is 1 in a row. And they had a Stanley Cup in 2007. They're only on the board 4 times. I got to change New Jersey's number here too. Because, yeah, I missed that. Look at that. All right. Arizona, who were Winnipeg, they're on the board 11 times. 4 in the 80s, 2 in the 90s, 2 in the 2000s, 3 in the 2010s, and their record is 2 in a row. So, yes, they're due to jump out of the bottom 5 this year because the record's 2 in a row. The Boston Bruins, once in the 90s, twice in the 2000s. Their record was 1 in a row, and so that's 3 overall, and they have a Stanley Cup in 2011. Didn't have to do a full teardown and rebuild. Yes, they got Joe Thornton at first overall. They didn't win a cup with Joe Thornton. He went to San Jose. They won a cup after he was traded. And Arizona is an example of how, yeah, a rebuild doesn't always work. Buffalo was not in the bottom 5 in the 80s or the 90s. Bottom 5 once in the 2010s, or 2000s, bottom 5 4 times so far in the 2010s, with 2019 yet to come. So overall, 5 times. Their record is twice, which is this past season and the year before that. Calgary, never in the 80s, once in the 90s, twice in the 2010s. The record is once in a row, and so they've been in the bottom 5 3 times since 1980, and they won a cup in 1989. Carolina and Hartford, this is combined, 4 times in the 80s, 3 times in the 90s, once in the 2000s, twice in the 2010s, and the record is 4 years in a row. And that was in the 80s. Didn't win a cup coming out of that, not in Hartford. And they won a Stanley Cup in 2006. They had been at the bottom in 2003. And they got Eric Stahl that year. So, not too bad. Pretty decent haul that year. Chicago, they've actually only been at the bottom 4 times. Once in the 80s, 3 times in the 2000s, which was 3 in a row. So Chicago gets mentioned a lot. But look, they won the draft lottery in 2007. Okay, when they were 5th from the bottom, or 5th from the bottom. They were barely on the board. So Chicago was bad, but not for that long. Not that bad. And you can debate whether Chicago should have been that bad in the 90s to make things better faster. But again, You get into that hole, just sell pieces off. Just get rid of players, and I don't like it. Colorado, twice in the 80s is Quebec. 3 times in the 90s, again, Quebec. Once in the 2000s, 3 times in the 2010s, and overall 4 times in a row is their record, which was 89, 90, 91, and 92. And of course, that is used as an example of that's how you build to a Stanley Cup. But the Lindros trade is what brought the Cup to Colorado, as well as moving to Colorado and getting Patrick Roy. And if Lindros had played for Quebec, I would argue that they don't win that Stanley Cup. Columbus didn't play in the first 2 decades. They're bottom 10 3 times in the 2000s, 3 times in the 2010s. The record for most in a row is, in fact, 3. And that was 2002, 2003, 2004. So, 6 altogether. No cup there. Of course, Chicago, for their rebuild, they do have 3 Stanley Cups to show for it, starting in 2010. And they get used as an example of, see, it can work. But Chicago built that roster around more than just Kane. They came out of it with Taves, too. And that Duncan Keith turned out to be pretty important, too. And Corey Crawford, who was not a first-round draft pick. So, again, it's your whole staff top to bottom. Dallas, 3 times the Minnesota North Stars were at the bottom in the 80s. Twice in the 90s, the Dallas Stars have not been in the bottom 5 in the 2000s or 2010s. And, of course, they won the Stanley Cup in 1999. Detroit, 5 times in the 80s, they're in the bottom 10, or bottom 5. Once in the 90s, and, of course, this past season in the 2010s. They got Yzerman. Yzerman was not a number 1 draft pick. Not as highly thought of as other players in that draft, and yet you look at it and you realize they get some cups. So, bunch of Stanley Cups to Detroit. Middling results in terms of how many times they're on the board, because they had 5 in the 80s, and 4 of those are in a row at the start. And if I'd gone back into the 70s, they would have had a couple on there as well. It was just a badly run team, and nobody wanted to play for Detroit in the early 80s. Edmonton, they're not on the board for the 80s, 3 times in the 90s, not on the board for the 2000s, and in the 2010s, they're on the board 6 times. And this is how you end up being ridiculed. New Jersey's on here 8, Toronto's on there 6 times in the 80s, and there's the Oilers with 6 times in the 2010s, which is all the more impressive, if you want to call it that, because there are so many more teams and it is that much harder to finish in the bottom 5. The Oilers, they're good at it. They've been bottom 5 3 times in a row twice. So they weren't in there this year. They weren't in there last year either. So that helps a bit, but honestly, people were terrified they were going to win the draft lottery again this year. Not sure why, because winning the draft lottery doesn't appear to help a whole lot when it comes to Stanley Cups. Florida, not around in the 80s, once in the 90s, 3 times in the 2000s, 4 times in the 2010s, and their record is 3 in a row. That 3 in a row came on here. 2001, 2002, 2003, did not win a Stanley Cup coming out of that. So again, that's your rebuild right there. That's your, they tear things down and do a rebuild. They didn't win a Stanley Cup coming out of that. LA, they're bottom 5 times in the 80s, 3 times in the 90s, 3 times in the 2000s. They're not bottom 5 at all in the 2010s. Now, again, Drew Doughty, they came out of a draft with and he kind of fantastic. Great. They've been bottom 5 3 times in a row twice. 11 times they're on the board. They have 2 Stanley Cups to show for it. So, again, LA can get used as an example of, yes, here you go. Minnesota, not on the board. Easy. Montreal, nothing for the 80s, 90s, or 2000s. Twice on the board in the 2010s. The Montreal Canadian fans have been spoiled for decades with one of the best teams in the league. So these hurt, because Montreal's not supposed to be down here. And they've never spent more than 1 year in the bottom 5, so yes, they're due to bounce back. Nashville, getting ahead of myself. Nashville, nothing for the 80s, obviously, they weren't around. Once in both the 90s, in the 2000s, and then in the 2010s. So their record is twice, because in 99 and 2000, they were bottom 5 in the league. But notice, that's their expansion years. Year 1 and year 2. They've only been bottom 5 once since then, and they got close to a Stanley Cup in 2017. So again, Nashville didn't need to do a rebuild even as an expansion team. Now, Colorado / New Jersey, the Rockies just miserable. The Devils miserable 8 times out of 10. 8. And then they were bottom 5 in 2017. Outside of that, very solid, very capable organization. And again, New Jersey being a strong, smart organization came down to drafting smart later on. Most of their big names, their draft picks, were not top 5, clearly. And they made smart free agent signings and trades, and that's really what it comes down to. The New York Islanders, they were bottom 5 once in the 80s, and that's 89. 5 times in the 90s, 4 times in the 2000s, 4 times in the 2010s. Their record is 3 in a row. They're on the board 14 times. That's the record. The Islanders are on the board more than anybody else. Period. And they were not on the board this year. That's the scary thing. Is that the Islanders haven't been on the board the last 2, 3, 4 years. 4 years since the Islanders were on this board. And it's still been a rough go for them. The New York Rangers, they're not on it at all. So they got a Stanley Cup in 1994. Now the Islanders, their 4 cups in a row at the start of the 80s, a lot of that was based on smart drafting. They got an excellent draft pick in Brian Trottier, but when you look at where guys like Bossy and Potvin were drafted, you're not looking at number 1. The Ottawa Senators weren't around in the 80s. They were bottom 5 4 times in a row in the 90s. They were the worst team in the league 4 years in a row in the 90s. They don't show up on the board in the 2000s, twice in the 2010s, including this past season, and of course the record is 4 in a row. And 4 in a row is nearly a record, other than Tampa's got 5 and New Jersey, who were Colorado for that too, have 6. 6 in a row. That's rough. Philly's only on the board once, and it's in the 2000s, and that's when they bottomed out. They ended up getting James Van Riemsdyk and jumped right back into the playoffs. So that's a retool if I've ever seen one. Pittsburgh's bottom 5 3 times in the 80s, once in the 90s, 4 times in the 2000s, so 8 overall. They're not really near the top of this chart. They had 4 years in a row where they were at or near the bottom, and of course that's 2002, 2003, 2004, 2006. 2005, of course, there was no season. Now, if 2005 had taken place, I would argue Pittsburgh would have been worst again, and we'd have a different number on the board. Of course, they came out of this with Marc-Andre Fleury, and they came out of it with Sid the Kid, and they drafted at 2 some guy named Malkin, and that worked out pretty well for them. But honestly, the Crosby pick was a lottery pick. So while we can look at that and go, well, the Penguins were bad, it was a lottery pick. Every team in the league had a shot at that pick, and it just happened Pittsburgh won it. And there was a lot of complaints at the time from yours truly about the fact Pittsburgh just happened to win another big lottery pick. It was just frustrating. That was the most tense draft lottery, though, because all 30 teams, random order. You had no idea who was coming out next. It was just amazing. On this side of the board, you got San Jose. San Jose, of course, not around in the 80s. 4 times their bottom 5 in the 90s. 2000s, 2010s, nothing. So the record for bottom 5s, twice in a row. 6 overall. They've never won a Stanley Cup, but they've never had to do a real rebuild either. St. Louis, they were bottom 5 once in the 80s, twice in the 2000s, and that's it. So no Stanley Cup, but a decent team and some good runs along the way, including the one where they just came up short against San Jose a few years ago. And, St. Louis is rebuilt on the fly and appears to be headed back to the playoffs this coming season. Tampa Bay, they weren't around in the 80s. The 90s, they're bottom 5 4 times. They're bottom 5 4 times in the 2000s and once in the 2010s. So Tampa, you can look at and say, well, they got Vinny LeCavalier and then they won the Stanley Cup. Or you can look and go, yeah, they got Brad Richards as a steal. And Habib Bulin turned out to be pretty darn good too. So, and their number 1 draft pick from 92, who was Roman Hamrlik, was gone by the time they won the Stanley Cup. So you can look at the run that the Tampa Bay Lightning went on, and you can point to those drafts, but really, in all honesty, it was the rest of the team as much as it was the fact that, yes, they got Vinny LeCavalier, who turned out to be pretty darn good. Toronto, 6 times in the 80s, they're bottom 5, 3 times in the 90s. Not bottom 5 at all in the 2000s, which is surprising. And 3 times they were bottom 5 in the 2010s. The record is 3 in a row. And there you see 2016, 2015. Coming out of the 2014-15 season, they said, we're not good enough. We're going to tear it down and do a proper rebuild. But they're only bottom 5 once. They got Austin Matthews. They held Marner and Nylander back. And then, there you go. The next season, they're right back up there. So Toronto, yes, technically right now, they're one of the better teams in the league. But look, you don't get Tavares just because you got Matthews. You get Tavares because he wanted to play at home, for one. And for two, they've built a really good team around Matthews. It's not just one player. And we can get fixated on one player, and I can be just as bad about that as anybody else. Because now we're up to Vancouver. 4 times they're bottom 5 in the 80s, 4 times in the 90s. Not once in the 2000s, but twice in the 2010s. 16 and 17. Surprisingly enough, they were not bottom 5 in 2018 because they went on a nice run at the end of the year. 10 times the Canucks have been bottom 5. They've never actually become the worst team in the league. They don't actually lead on any one given season, and it has bit them on the ass a lot. I think back to 1990. They grabbed Peter Nedved. If they drafted first, they could have gone to Owen Nolan. Who knows what happens then? The most famous example would be, the wheel of fate spinning, and they get Dale Talon. Buffalo gets Gilbert Perreault, and that's how that works. Vancouver back in 86 and 87. They lose out on Pierre Turgeon because they're not quite bad enough. 88, they lose out on Modano because they're not quite bad enough. And this is just that's just the way it works out. And it's kind of their fate. 99, they're second. They still won that draft because they get the Sedin twins. So it all depends on how you go into it and how you work it. And of course, 2017, they're one of the worst teams in the league. And in the draft lottery, they dropped to 5th. But that's how the draft lottery works. Washington, twice they're bottom 5 in the 80s. That's the first 2 years. Once in the 90s, 3 times in the 2010s. And of course, famously, they came out of this with Ovechkin. So Ovechkin makes it look like that's what you do. You just do that rebuild and you'll be fine. But the reason that they got to draft Ovechkin is because they were crap. Coming out of the Kolzig era, the Capitals just mismanaged everything. Guys got old and moved on, and they just didn't have a talented enough roster to make up for it. The Yager experiment was a disaster in Washington, and they didn't come out of that with enough. The Winnipeg Jets, 5 times in the 2000s. 5 times the Atlanta Thrashers finished in the bottom 5. And you could argue, if you wanted to argue, that there were some really solid prospects that have been turned into decent players for the Jets, but honestly, we have yet to see a Stanley Cup, despite those 5 bottom 5 finishes in 10 years. Now, number 1 draft picks who've won Stanley Cups along all of this, 2007, Patrick Kane, that's the most recent. So we all talk about number 1 draft picks, and of course we talk about Connor McDavid a lot, and rightfully so, but if he doesn't win a Stanley Cup in Edmonton, he's not going to be alone in that. So 2007, Patrick Kane. 2005, Sid the Kid. 2004, Alex Ovechkin. 2003, Marc-Andre Fleury. Right in here. And 2006 was Eric Johnson of the Blues. But right in here from 2003 to 2007, this is why people will look and go, well, you get that guy, you'll win a Stanley Cup. But it's not that easy. 1998, Vinny LeCavalier. Then you got to go back to 1988, Mike Modano. 1986, Joe Murphy. I could put an asterisk there because when Murphy wins the Stanley Cup, it's in Edmonton. And he's not a prime player. But he's there and he wins a cup. 84, Mario Lemieux. And when you look at the cup rings, of course, you've got 3 with Kane. You got 3 with Crosby. 1 with Ovechkin. 3 with Marc-Andre Fleury. 1 with LeCavalier. 1 with Modano. 1 with Murphy. And 2 with Mario. So it all depends on how you look at it. At the end of the day, being the worst team in the league and doing that rebuild, it's a mixed bag as to whether or not it helps you win and whether or not having a number 1 draft pick on your roster means you're going to be any better come playoff time. You have to build the team properly, which the GMs on these teams did, and GMs of other teams have struggled to do. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.